Hello, I'm Kyle Dyer, and welcome to Colorado Inside Out on this Friday, May the 3rd. This coming Wednesday, the 8th, is the last day of the 2024 legislative session, and this week, Governor Polis signed off on the budget for the next fiscal year, and he also worked some compromises, but there is still a lot to get to in the remaining days of the session. Not only do lawmakers have a lot to discuss, so does our panel this week, so let me introduce you to Patty Calhoun, founder and editor of Westward, Tyrone Glover, civil rights and criminal attorney here in Denver, Jesse Paul, reporter and editor at the Colorado Sun, and Laura Aldrete, building consultant and former planning director for the city and county of Denver. Thanks you all for coming this week. Governor Polis seems to be shifting this legislative session somewhat and working on compromises, specifically when it comes to income taxes and Tabor refunds, and also a deal with the oil and gas industry. Patty, let's start with you.
Well, amazingly, how fast it seemed these compromises came down. They could have been talked about for a long time, but on Monday and Tuesday, he really pulled through with some compromises. They're going to save us a lot of headaches at the ballot box, especially the oil and gas compromise, where you had dueling ballot measures that might have been there in November, which would have canceled each other out. Very confusing. He came up with a deal where oil and gas will help pay. They will be able to continue drilling, but they will pay for, it's estimated to bring in $138 million a year, and 80% of that will go to public transportation, which definitely helped with environmentalists concerned about clean air. So that was a great compromise if all the pieces still fall together. And we've got 5 more days at the legislature where things could happen. The other one that was really interesting was continuing to play with Tabor to see how we could bring relief to lower class, middle class people, but still have money for the government. So I know everyone else will talk more about that, but it looks like a tax break.
It looks like a tax break because it is a tax break. But at the end of the day, I think the intent is noble, to try to redistribute some of this $700 million so that we can have a Colorado that really works for all. And the impact of this money, I think, if it comes to fruition, is really staggering and can improve the lives of folks with modest means and who are really struggling, especially during this time of inflation, which seems to be leveling, but is still very much a problem. The real concern, though, because this is a tax break, is it just really widening this gap that we are going to have with inequality here in Colorado. It's nice if we can have some relief this year and maybe for years to come, but if we continue to see the folks at the bottom continue to just get more and more desperate, and the folks at the top continue to benefit more and more, we're going to be dealing with problems that are going to be decades in the making to undo.
I think something that voters and Coloradans should pay attention to are all of these tax expenditures that the legislature is doling out, because they're done in a year where the budget has a surplus, but looking forward, that's not a guarantee. So there are questions down the line about all this money that the legislature is spending and whether or not they can continue things into the next and next and next fiscal year. Big questions there. Big victory for the governor in winning the income tax reduction as part of the deal with Democrats to do all these expenditures. Democrats have been kind of rolling their eyes at this. They didn't want to do an income tax reduction at the governor's request because they thought it was too inequitable. And then also Republicans had been holding the governor's feet to the fire on his income tax promise that he made during his State of the State address. And actually you see that bill be bipartisan, which is pretty interesting at the end of session. On the oil and gas side of things, I think that was probably the biggest deal made in this topic area since 2014, the last time that the then Congressman Polis was involved in it, and then Governor John Hickenlooper. But I would urge people to dig into these pieces of legislation, look closely at them, because when deals like this get cut in the final days of the session, there's all kinds of landmines that are in these 45, 50, 60-page bills, and I'm already finding some of them in this stuff.
Well, certainly, Jesse, as you mentioned, right, the way that the process happens tends to happen in legislature as we get down to the last minute, as we are again, and all the deals are getting cut. I will say from a process standpoint overall, I think the governor came through, and I would think the lawmakers came through much better than they did last year in terms of stakeholdering, looking to collaborate, having conversations, making compromise. I think also there's a tepid shout out for the budget, which added almost $140 million for higher education, 13 million of which is towards financial aid. That being said, it moves us from 49th in the country for funding higher education to 43rd. Not something to be proud of or a winning moment for Colorado, but at least we're moving in the right direction.
That is true. So we're talking about compromise, but there have also been problems amongst lawmakers through this whole session, but this week, and there's still a lot to get to, Tyrone.
Yeah, and I'm watching HB 1460, sort of our newest iteration of law enforcement accountability, which has been limping along. And who knows, by the time this airs, we may be looking at a very different landscape. But, you know, the simple proposition that any sort of misconduct needs to be thoroughly investigated and the people reporting it need to be protected. It's a proposition that we have in our larger companies and institutions and amongst just regular old citizens, right? This needs to also apply to law enforcement. The folks that are trying to speak up for what they see as corruption, for what they see as a lack of training or policies or misdeeds need the same whistleblower protections. So I'm hopeful that in some form this can actually move forward and be passed so we have transparency and trust once again.
Jesse, are there certain things that you're looking to see if they pan out?
The thing we still haven't seen is property taxes. And lawmakers have been talking about this since November when Proposition HH failed. They had the bipartisan Property Tax Commission, and last week a draft proposal came out talking about what they thought they were going to do on property taxes. It went to the tax commission, who said, no thanks, go back to the drawing board, Democrats, and figure this out. So, you know, this is coming down to the last minute for the third or fourth year in a row. It's creating uncertainty for homeowners in Colorado, and now we've got these conservative ballot measures kind of bearing down on us too on the November ballot, which would have huge implications for the state budget. A lot of big questions to go. Democrats, again, have had 120 days to do this. They had a special session, they had a property tax commission, and they still don't have much to show for it. And I think that shows both how politically difficult this issue is and also how complicated it is. Anytime you kind of pull one lever, it affects another one. And so I really don't know how things are going to shape out. I think there's a strong chance that nothing gets done this session, and now there's already talk of a special session. So there's a ton of pressure on lawmakers to do something because of the strain that the November ballot measures will put on the budget and on local governments and schools and all of the great things that we're talking about that are in the budgets, fully funding education, that could all be at risk if they don't do anything and these ballot measures in November pass.
Okay, Laura.
Well, of course, land use is near and dear to my heart, and we've got 1 down successfully and 4 to go. These are necessary steps for communities to tackle and solve the hard issues around affordable housing instead of just making excuses of why it can't happen. I think worse yet, though, we have seen fear-mongering used, such as in Greenwood Village, where they have literally tried to put the fear of God into residents around the harm that an ADU might do in their community, which is not true. So it's unfortunate to see that. I do think there's another quiet bill called the Right to Remedy Construction Defect, which is a Senate bill trying to move through. It has been trying to rectify a 2008 construction defect law that has removed a product, an attainable housing product from the Colorado market, which would allow Gen Z and millennials to have that ability for wealth accumulation. And right now, literally in the state of Colorado, we do not have that ability to do that. So I'm hopeful that we will move that forward.
Okay, right, Patty.
Think about it. As we entered this week, there were still over 300 bills to be considered. So a lot of worthwhile things will go by the wayside. Jesse's right that some of the ones that pass will have pitfalls, laws of unintended consequences that we will only find out many years later, like the statute of limitations bill that had passed in 2021 on sex assault victims. And that they tried to rectify this year, and that went down. Also looking like it went down, the social media regulations bill. On Wednesday, there was a really unusual consortium of free speech advocates, natural medicine advocates who were fighting that bill, and that seems to be gone. And coming back, which is really interesting, is a second book banning bill, which is to protect libraries and people who work at libraries from the scattershot proposals to ban books, and that's a good First Amendment issue.
So as the state lawmakers close out the session, attention now turns to the primary races that are at the end of June here in Colorado. Voters will be voting on all sorts of positions. We have legislative races. Voters will be voting for CU Regent leadership, Board of Education positions, congressional representatives, district attorneys. There is a lot people will be voting on. Jesse, there's been a lot of talk within the congressional races and some of the candidates this week as well, talking about their relationship to their parties.
Yeah, so I'm calling this the year of the primary. June 25th is going to be a big date in a lot of different races across the state, particularly in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th congressional districts where those are Republican districts where the Republican incumbents are stepping down. And a lot of the focus this week, at least, has been on the Colorado GOP's decision to endorse candidates in at least the 4th district so far, but it's looking to make endorsements as well in the 4th and 5th districts, maybe in the 8th district too. And there's a lot of frustration from candidates toward Colorado GOP Chair Dave Williams to make this decision to do endorsements. It's not something that the party has done before. The party sent out a questionnaire to candidates asking them questions about Trump and Democrats and abortion and things like that, trying to get their take on these different things to make a decision about whether or not to endorse them. And some of the leading candidates in these races said, we're not going to participate. So Gabe Evans in the 8th congressional district, who's widely seen as the front runner in the Republican primary there. And then in the 3rd congressional district, Steve Varela, a Board of Education member who made the ballot by the district nominating assembly process. They're really fighting each other as opposed to Democrats, and that's not a good position for Republicans to be in a state where they're already in huge minorities.
Mm-hmm. Laura.
Well, I want to start with in talking about District 4, what's actually newsworthy there and what's not? And do we really want to keep giving this oxygen to leaders who, instead of guiding their constituents, are just behaving poorly? District 8, however, I do think is noteworthy. And the way that the national conversation around immigration has played out nationally, and then now at the District 8 level, where you have such a concern, whether real or perceived, based on perception around immigration that is weighing in on people's minds. I think it should be a cause for concern for the Democrats and for Caraveo to figure out what that message needs to be and get in front of that, because I think that is driving some of the polls. However correct they are, I think that is certainly influencing District 8.
Right, because the polls show that Gabe is very close
Yes.
to, yeah, so. Patty.
Watching Ken Buck giving his exit interviews, first of all, you wonder why anyone would want to go to Congress, except for maybe the gym. Everyone seems to like the gym, but the picture he paints of just the discord there and the inability to get anything done. I mean, he talked about the swamp when he first went in. He's really experienced the swamp as he goes out, and ironically has also created quite the swamp by not running again, because the 4th district is just such a crazy mess right now. We'll know who emerges. It's going to be a numbers game on June 25th because there are just so many candidates. But going back to what Jesse said about the Republican Party, I looked over that long questionnaire about the endorsement, which is basically, would you like to see Donald Trump as the new Messiah? I mean, it's not exactly that question, but it certainly is a litmus test that you have to pass in order to get any kind of recommendation from the Colorado Republican Party. Shame on them. I mean, when Ken Buck was the head of the Colorado Republican Party, he definitely ran it the way you were supposed to, which is to be fair to all the different candidates.
Tyrone.
I want to revisit some of Laura's comments on our national conversation around immigration. We are in a crisis, as it relates to sort of the number of migrants and providing them resources. And I just hope that what's happening in District 8 is not an indication that we're simply just going to blame current leadership, because, this is a problem and a crisis that has been, administrations and parties and decades in the making. Is one that, extends past our borders, that is global in nature, and the best people for the job to ultimately, I think, fix this at the end of the day are those who can work together and come together to come up with creative ways to actually deal with this. So there is a tendency to simply blame those in power and turn this into sort of a partisan back and forth. And I just hope what we're seeing in the polling in District 8 is not an indication of sort of a larger national conversation around this.
Okay. Pro-Palestine protests are taking place on college campuses across Colorado, some larger than others, with students telling their colleges that they want them to divest from, companies that support Israel. And we're seeing this across the country. Laura.
Honestly, I'm sad and disappointed. I think the name of the game in any of these situations where there's tension is de-escalation. Protesting is an incredibly important part of the American democracy, and personally was formative in my years at CU, Boulder. And Auraria campus just misstepped, I think, in two critical ways. One, they didn't have the proper training in place for their campus police officers, and two, they didn't have a plan in place once they started that escalation of where it was going to go and how they were going to move the students off and all the material. And right, so then you're back right in the same place that they ended up, that they started with the protesters. And what if instead of, for the students, what if instead of picking a side on a complex issue that is very distant from our borders that we probably really don't fully understand, what if we look to broaden our understanding of both the Muslim, Palestine, and Jewish experience here in Colorado and look to practice and participate in building bridges in that way instead of making judgment on an issue that we probably don't fully understand.
Okay.
It would be great to be able to see educational forums out there with people listening to each other. So far, at least in the Denver and Colorado protests, it's been relatively civil compared to, say, Madison or Columbia or what we've seen in California. But it was a week ago that they cleared out the campus. Tents were back within the next day. It doesn't look like they're going anywhere now. What you want is the students to be able to practice free speech without impeding the ability of those who want to get an education and go into class to go into class. And above all, what you don't want is for any students to feel unsafe. I mean, when you've heard the Jewish students around the country who are scared to go to school now, scared to get an education, and that's horrifying. So somehow you have to protect everybody's rights to get an education, to have free speech, and good luck with classes ending and graduation next week. Will Auraria be able to handle it right?
I know. All right, Tyrone.
One thing that saddens me about the response by law enforcement to many of these protests, it's as though they didn't learn from the George Floyd protests after a federal injunction coming from this district, after numerous lawsuits, resulting in, millions of dollars being paid out. We're still seeing a lot of the same conduct. These students are taking playbooks out of their professors, their parents, their uncles and aunts, right, that they did in the 60s and the 70s, but they're being met with much different force in the way of riot gear and rubber bullets and pepper spray and tear gas. And there needs to be a forum for this type of expression. Colleges and universities have really been the epicenter for anti-war and peace activism and protests historically. We need to make sure that forum is there, alive and well, that civil disobedience, that good trouble can be gotten into, and it's going to be inconvenient, but that's kind of the point.
Okay. Jesse, your thoughts?
Well, I'm stuck at the Capitol these days, so I'll focus on things on that. But look, I think when we talked in December, we were sitting at this table right after the special session and curious about how, the conflict in the Middle East was going to play out at the legislature. And I just want to say, in the final week, I think people have done a good job of having respectful conversation at the Capitol this year. You haven't seen too much interruption. There have been instances where there has been disagreement, but mostly it's been civil. And I think I'm frankly a little surprised that some of the stuff that's been happening on campuses hasn't spilled over into the Capitol building. And maybe that changes in the final days, but it's been refreshing to see with all of the vitriol that often happens at the Capitol to have a good conversation on this issue at times where people have been able to hear each other and I think respect each other on it.
That is positive news. All right, thanks for sharing. Now it's time for us to go down the line here and have our panelists talk about some of the highs and lows that they witnessed this past week. So we'll start with something negative, something that really bothers you, Patty.
We're going to see it tomorrow when Kristi Noem comes to town for a Republican fundraiser. We heard the revelation of how she shot her puppy for misbehaving, and it's rocked around the country. And she's going to be here during Furry Scurry Day. And also there'll be a protest, a dog protest with well-behaved pets outside her appearance. So it's just a disgrace that she felt she had to confess that and that she actually had to shoot her dog in the first place.
And this is a fundraiser that she's coming to speak at?
She's coming to support Colorado Republicans.
Okay. Okay, it'll be interesting to see what happens there. Tyrone.
This notion that, the road to justice, I think, is sometimes murky. I mean, last week we had the sentencing in the Elijah McClain case where one of the officers was given probation on a homicide case, one of the paramedics. And then we had the Christian Glass case where we had a hung jury. And so now my heart goes out to the family. They're now going to have to wait again for a retrial. Luckily, we have a 90-day turnaround on that. So I believe they're likely going to try the case in August if it doesn't get continued. It's commendable. I mean, I think 10, 15, 20 years ago, you wouldn't see prosecutors, going out on a limb the way that they are and impaneling grand juries and actually bringing charges against these officers. But when we look at the results of how folks who are not in these positions with these privileges, what happens with them when they're in front of a jury and what happens with them when they're in front of judges and are ultimately sentenced, it's disproportionate, and that's still unfortunate. But we've made, I think, some progress here, and it's commendable that we actually have leaders in law enforcement who want to keep and want to hold folks in power accountable. We just got to keep on going. Justice delayed, but hopefully not justice denied.
Right. Jesse.
I will point out that reporters have been barred from the Kristi Noem Jefferson County Republicans event, so no reporters will be there to see or listen to what she talks about. My disappointment is with the lawmakers who have resorted to social media this session instead of having conversations with each other and lobbyists and journalists just to attack each other, and I think you saw some of that play out this week in frustration, understandably, from some folks, and I just... conversations in the hallway of the Capitol are where democracy happens, right? You can see it every single day, and I wish more of that was happening and less attacking people on social media.
Mm-hmm. Laura.
I'm headed down the same line as Jesse is in terms of the disgrace of the week is leadership. We saw it at the lack of leadership with the university Auraria campus, choosing escalation. We saw it with lawmakers publicly name-calling, engaging in the breakdown of discourse, stammering out of chambers. We continue to see the Colorado Rockies leadership drive the organization and our state pride into despair. And I think in my conversations, I have a sense that people are looking for somebody to stand in that space of leadership and lead by example.
Lead by example, that's what we need. Something good, Patty, that you saw.
Thank you to Denver Water for giving everyone a laugh this week with its Splash Street Singers.
I loved it. That's mine. You took mine of the week, but
Sorry.
it is great. All right, Tyrone.
Cinco de Mayo this weekend is one of those holidays that I think folks tend to struggle with how to celebrate, but luckily we have some great celebrations here in Denver, and the one at Civic Center Park is one of the largest and most long-standing in the region. So I feel like if you want to at least get close to celebrating it in the right way, it's a great place to start.
Fun weekend. It's going to be great weather after
Yes.
the rain gets out of here.
Mm-hmm.
I'm excited for the end of the legislative session so I can see my wife and dog again. But in all seriousness, right, I mean, we're heading into election season, which is exciting in Colorado, and, excited to talk to voters and hear what their concerns are, and hopefully that shapes, whoever gets elected, and maybe next year's legislative session helps inform how I cover the state.
We are happy for you that next week is almost here.
Thank you, yeah.
Laura.
I'm going to take a deeper dive on Cinco de Mayo, which is this Sunday, and newsflash, it is not a drinking fest. It's regarded by Chicanos and Latinos in the United States as a moment for us to find strength based on a history of a small Mexican troop defeating the French army in 1862 in Puebla, Mexico. And it's a reminder for us about how to take that strength into social justice that we have been working on for the past 80, 90 years. And so while we are drinking our margaritas or sipping our margaritas and mezcals on Sunday, I think it is a moment for us to reflect on our need to continue with social justice, that it just continues.
I like that. Thank you. And to play on Patty's Denver water plug, I mean, they did this video, I Water That Way, to the Backstreet Boys, I Want It That Way. And the Backstreet Boys actually commented on Instagram and said, you guys nailed this. So I don't think I'll ever hear that song, though, on the radio and not hear the word water. So it was good, though. Well done. Well done, panel. Thanks for coming this week. We appreciate it, especially Jesse. Thank you for taking a break from the legislature. We'll see you next week here on PBS 12. And don't forget, we have our podcast on Spotify. Have a great weekend and happy Cinco de Mayo.
PBS 12 believes in the power of original, local programming. Help us bring more shows, like the one you just watched, by donating at pbs12.org/program support today.